My name is Lauren Zayu, and we're back for the second season of Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, the show about what you say and how you say it. We'll be chronicling the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration on everything from immigration to HBCUs. So join me for a crash course on this country's politics, current events, and how we move forward. Hi, and welcome to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. I'm your host, Lauren Zayu. The anti-Asian racism and hate crimes have increased at alarming rates in recent months. Some allege because of early reports of COVID-19 deriving from China. However, racism against Asian populations has been prevalent long before COVID-19 through harmful stereotypes and dismissal of experiences. We have with us today two women who are bringing awareness to this issue through academia and activism, Aryani Ong and Janelle Wong. Aryani Ong is a civil rights attorney, activist, and consultant who has worked on Asian American issues for 30 years. She is founder and co-director of the Montgomery County Progressive Asian American Network. Aryani also is co-founder and senior advisor to Communities United Against Hate in Montgomery County, working with national Asian American civil rights organizations like AAAJ, Asian American Justice Center, and OCA-Asian Pacific American Advocates. She has tracked hate crime data for national reports, written a community response guide, lobbied for a stronger federal law, and spoken before audiences nationally and before the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Janelle Wong is a co-director of the Montgomery County Progressive Asian American Network in Maryland. In her day job, she is a professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm excited to welcome to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, Janelle Wong and Aryani Ong. Hello to you both.
Hi, Lauren.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Thank y'all for being here. We can start with you, Aryani, just kind of in your background and the work that you do, how this plays a role.
Yes, thank you. So I'm a civil rights attorney, activist, and consultant, who's focused on Asian American issues for the last 30 years. And I started on this course coincidentally, given the recent news, because of a hate crime in 1982. So I was in middle school, and I was very struck by the injustice of the punishment, which was to allow the perpetrators who committed a murder of a Chinese American man who was mistaken as Japanese. The judge let them go. They were two white men because they did not seem like the type of people who should serve time, is what the judge said. And even as like a 13-year-old, I understood that that was not just, and went on to college and then law school and graduated and worked for a number of national Asian American civil rights organizations and specialized in combating hate crimes and also profiling. So today I'm founder and co-director of the Montgomery County Progressive Asian American Network, and also co-founder of a local anti-hate crime coalition called Communities United Against Hate in Montgomery County. And I've tracked hate crime data for national reports, written a community response guide, lobbied for federal law, and spoken before audiences nationally. And in a different sphere, I also advocate for civil rights, civil liberties, protections for Asian Americans who face discrimination when there's heightened national security concerns.
That sounds like great work. Thank you for doing it. And Janelle, how about you?
Hi, so thank you again for having us. I'm a professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Maryland, and so I've been teaching about and researching Asian American issues for the past 20 years, and my focus is on Asian American political participation, civic engagement, and public opinion. And I moved to this area, the DMV, about 10 years ago now, and met Aryani and have been working with Aryani in different capacities. And we thought it was really important to represent and to try to lift up progressive Asian American voices in our region.
Thank you for that as well. And while we're here, I think just a general overview and history of what anti-Asian racism has looked like in this country. And Janelle, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, many may not know that Chinese immigrants were actually the first undocumented immigrants in the US. And this is because they were subject to some of the first exclusionary immigration laws regulating immigration to US shores. So these laws were known as the Chinese Exclusion Acts and passed in the late 1880s. And the justification for these laws were that Chinese were so fundamentally different from other Americans, especially white Americans, in terms of appearance, culture, and religion, that their presence was seen to pose a deep threat among the established white community to the American way of life. And so these beliefs, along with ideas that Asians were a menacing horde that would drive down the wages of white men, led to a lot of anti-Asian sentiment and violence. So this led to the lynching of Chinese in Los Angeles, the eventual barring of immigrants from most Asian countries. And I think it's important to note that while European immigrants to the US from Italy, from Ireland also faced widespread racial discrimination, only Asian immigrants were prohibited from naturalization based on their racial status. So the idea that Asian Americans constitute a foreign threat justifies lots of anti-Asian behaviors, including state-sponsored discrimination like Japanese American internment during World War II. So this all kind of shifted in some interesting ways, but also stayed the same over time. As we moved into the mid-20th century, the US was, in this Cold War situation, and the Cold War, the need to show its kind of progressivism to the rest of the world during that time meant that the US had to sort of demonstrate that it was not oppressing its own people as it was condemning communism around the world. And so the Cold War pressures and the Black freedom movements of the first half of the 20th century really pushed Congress then to lift barriers to Asian immigration, those restrictive barriers and exclusion in the 1950s and 60s. And then the US began to recruit, just lifted those quotas and instituted two new kinds of immigration priorities. One was family reunification, so people who were already here could sponsor their family members. And another important one, the most important for Asian Americans and the growth of Asian Americans, was a new priority which was based on occupational skills. And so the US began to recruit highly educated immigrants from Asia, and this ramped up over time. So in the 1990s, people from Asian countries became the most likely to benefit from what's called now the H-1B program, that is professional skill visas. So that changes the economic complexion of the Asian American population in the US. And so we had been this kind of forever foreigner, and now a new kind of stereotype attaches to us, and that's the model minority, the idea that Asian Americans are like super competent. And this stereotype acts in tandem with the forever foreigner stereotype, always lurking and ready to be activated in times of instability. So it's important to know that there's been changes in immigration law. Those have changed the way people view Asian Americans. Asian Americans are now highly educated, such that Asian immigrants, especially let's say Chinese immigrants, 50% of Chinese immigrants in the US have a college degree, but only 8% of Chinese in China have a college degree. And so there's this hyperselectivity. The bottom line is that there's two stereotypes: the model minority stereotype, the forever foreigner stereotype. Those are the stereotypes that shape the experience of Asian Americans in the US. And anytime there's national instability, like an economic downturn, or in this case, this moment, a pandemic, anti-Asian sentiment rooted in this longstanding white supremacist history, white supremacist policies, starts to come to the fore, and we must then address the roots of the problem through this lens of really taking the history of white supremacy and anti-Asian sentiment seriously.
Thank you for that so much. I think like one, threading the needle on how all of those work together and how like stereotypes can be two sides of the same coin, right? And that neither ultimately offer people the full humanity of who they are, or ultimately are helpful in navigating the systems that we're in. I think it's so important to remember in a moment like this. And so I really appreciate you walking us through that history to understand. Aryani, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
So like I mentioned, some of my current work has to do with enacting safeguards for, in this case, because there's tensions between US and China for Chinese Americans who work in our contract with the federal government, because they're under increased scrutiny due to the fear that they're under foreign influence, which is defined by the prospect that they or their parents who have immigrated and naturalized and become US citizens still have divided loyalties. So such broad sweeping thinking means that Chinese Americans can be accused on mere suspicion by their colleagues who are disgruntled, and this has happened in different cases, and they can receive no benefit of the doubt for things like using their supervisor's password, which is open for use by the whole team, and entering it with the supervisor present. Consequently, there's been hundreds of Chinese Americans have been investigated and some prosecuted, and others have lost their security clearances and therefore their jobs, which also signal an end to their federal career. So this idea of forever foreigner or perpetual foreigner stereotype that Professor Wong talked about is real and has tangible harm. Especially when it's placed into policies and practices and institutionalized in our government agencies.
Yeah, I can definitely see how I guess the divided loyalty element of the forever foreigner stereotype implies that people are untrustworthy simply because of who they are, which is so much of the background and backbone of white supremacy as a whole. This notion that with white being the standard, everything else is suspicious. And so it is seeing the way that this is playing out across multiple cultures, across American history, is ultimately speaks to the fact that America is often so rooted in whiteness and white supremacy that other people don't even get the opportunity to get in the door and prove themselves. And so I appreciate y'all sharing that. And as we transition into Hold Up, I wanted to kind of have a conversation about anti-Asian racism overall in the way that it's discussed and not discussed. I feel like for a lot of people, the hate crime that just happened in Atlanta is a lot of their first time hearing about anti-Asian sentiment. And so why isn't it discussed in the same way that a lot of other isms are across our history and society? And we can start this one with you, Aryani.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I used to actually track hate crimes and hate incidents against Asian Americans for then the only national report, and that was collected by affiliates around the country. So, we had been seeing hate against Asian Americans. They come from the same root as is affecting all people of color, including indigenous communities and women and LGBTQ. It's just that there are pressures now that bring more to the fore Asian Americans as a target. And so there's two prominent ones right now, and one is COVID-19. So when that pandemic broke out, a public who already mistakens Asian Americans as Asians because they don't, again, because of this perpetual foreigner stereotype, they were imputing this COVID virus with anyone around them who looked, Chinese, when in fact, they may not have been Chinese. They also may have been Japanese American or Vietnamese American, or in the case of the stabbing in Midland, Texas, at the Sam's Club of a family, a father and two young children, 2 and 4. There was a man who was convinced that they were COVID carriers and slashed them, especially the young children. They had huge gashes in the side of their head. And so there was a heroic employee who intervened, but he's also on, it sort of slashed his hand and he had to leave his employment because of disabilities. But that's whole nother story. I think the point is that, they're Burmese American, but I think we all became Chinese American. The second thing is, again, as I alluded to, the U.S.-China tensions, the geopolitics, Asian Americans are particularly susceptible to in cycles. So anytime there's a tension between the U.S. and a foreign nation, it's the immigrants who come from their country of origin, even though they've established themselves here and have loyalties to the U.S., they're still seen with suspicion. So to end it, what we see is that, people getting accosted in the street, go back to China, are you spies? All the way to, spitting and verbal assaults and physical assaults in order to just expunge what they see as the foreign element.
Yeah. And I'm remembering, particularly when COVID first was on the scene and there was so little known about it, the element of it coming from China was played up on the right and left. People were very much churning in on this idea. And I remember even a reporter who had an encounter with the former president, where he made a comment to her where he used a derogatory slur that I don't feel the need to repeat. But she responded and was like, "Are you speaking to me in this way? Why are you speaking to me in this way?" And it was this very tense moment that highlighted what this has looked like for so many people in their day-to-day lives, that like these small jabs, or what people will call small jabs, are ultimately continuations of stereotypes. And Professor Wong, I want to bring you in on this element as well, because I know that you say that you study the politics of Asian Americans and how this has happened. And so what does it look like there as well?
So, I think you ask an important question. In what ways have Asian Americans been part of the conversation on race, and in what ways have they not? And I think the way that I think about our own identity and Asian Americans in the country is that we really shine a light on the complexities of racial position in the US. And so, on the one hand, we have long faced kind of discrimination that we just talked about. On the other hand, because of US immigration laws, we have achieved certain kinds of advantages in the US. For instance, on average, Asian Americans now exhibit the highest income of any racial group in the US. And that's partly because of high levels of education. And so if you look within those education groups, you can see, for instance, that among all people with a bachelor's degree, men still make more on the dollar than Asian American men, but there are more Asian Americans with that level of education. Now, that, there's some discrimination there, there's some advantage there when we think about this kind of these socioeconomic resources. So, and one of the things that I think is very obvious right now is that Asian Americans, despite their economic achievements, may still face these kinds of accusations of being foreign, the presumption of not belonging. And so there's something that we all have to kind of rethink about race in the US, that it's not an either or, that we can both hold, kind of privileges, and we acknowledge those privileges, that Asian Americans, yes, there is a wave of anti-Asian hate going on right now, but it is not the same. It's actually distinct in form from, let's say, state-sponsored police brutality. Asian Americans face some of the lowest levels of that kind of violence. And so we have to acknowledge that too, right? That there is this, it does all come from white supremacist roots, but it manifests in very different ways. And so I think that's what's important to acknowledge here, that there's not a one size fits all way of understanding race, and yet we're still all connected. There are different ways that we're racialized. The thing that this moment brings up is tremendous diversity within the Asian American population. Particularly, the Atlanta shootings really show that we are divided in important ways by class, and we do not all have the same experience based on class status. And so Asian Americans today are the most economically polarized. That's partly because there's been tremendous growth at the top, but not lifting all members of the community. And so, you know, Asian Americans both hold the most wealth and are poorer, according to statistics, than their white counterparts. And so what we see in the Atlanta shooting incident is that it was immigrant, working class women who were in these kind of economically vulnerable positions. And that incident should remind us and help us to see that there are divisions within communities. We're still connected by race, but we really have to attend to the most vulnerable in our communities, and that's who was targeted by this act.
Absolutely. I was actually thinking about the diversity, one, in even saying Asian and Asian America, that encompasses so many countries and experiences. And so there has been a vastly different, I guess, experience and therein like reaction to state-sponsored violence. And while we're on the topic there, I thought, you know, the hate crime in Atlanta was a complete and utter awful tragedy. And accompanying that was the state-sponsored gaslighting that came on the heels of, you know, oh, he had a bad day. Oh, it wasn't racially motivated. He, you know, had other issues. And I wanted to kind of sit with the idea that so much of the way racism and narratives perpetrate themselves throughout history is by the state in various ways, I guess, not being willing to cede that racism exists or that racism can exist in tandem, right? So this idea that these women were in exceptionally vulnerable positions economically, racially, and otherwise, and that this person knew that he could exploit that vulnerability because of who they were. And so this idea that, oh, it's not about that because it's about this, it's like, actually, it's about both. And part of the problem is that we don't see these people as, or others don't see these people as valid and in need of protecting. And so it has been such to see the fallout of this has been so, I honestly, disparagingly familiar to see the police respond in this way, to see law enforcement respond in this way. And then to see, as you're talking about the difference, right? I think so often people can cite statistics to combat narratives. And it's like, actually, all of it goes together. So yes, a lot of Asian people are making a lot of money. A lot of people are also not. And so we have to keep in mind both of those when we're having conversations on progress overall. And so I definitely agree there. And since we're on the topic of narratives and experiences, I wanted to also give the both of you time to talk about the organization you founded and some of the work that you do in Montgomery County. You could do either of you. So I guess Janelle, if we want to start there since we started with Aryani last time.
Yeah, so this is a very new organization, and one of the reasons that we founded it is to also join in coalition and solidarity with other organizations. And so we are part of the Black-Brown Coalition for Educational Excellence and Equity here in the county. We have been it's been interesting to see that over the last 3 months, there has been a real interest, I think, in the issues that Asian Americans are facing. And we have been called upon to join in various kinds of activities that I'll let Aryani describe in more detail. But I think, you know, at its heart, we are recognizing that, you know, that old term that we aren't free until all of us are free. And that is really the impetus for this organization. We do not want to have racial equity conversations or conversations about racial inequality in the US without showing up for other groups, with other groups, and for the Asian American community.
Yeah, so to add what Janelle was saying, we're part of the second generation, of Asian Americans. And so after the parent generation has established themselves, then you begin to see more civic participation. With that, people begin to sort of fan out into different interests, right? So the idea of organizing around an Asian American identity becomes more attenuated. And what we found in our county, especially being proximate to Washington, D.C., is that, people are working in different fields and with different organizations and not necessarily communicating a policy position that's aligned with progressive agendas. And so what was happening in the county was that there was a void there, and yet there were other diverse perspectives, but the county leadership was not recognizing that. They were, seeing the Asian Americans as a monolith, and seeing like a subgroup of a subgroup representing. They were viewing them as representing the Asian Americans. So we felt that it was necessary to come out and present ourselves, if not just for the mere fact that we are a diverse community. There's, almost 50 ethnic groups and 100 languages. And, even within the same ethnic group, there's differences along immigration history, along, generation, and definitely along, political views. So that is like one of the reasons why we came together. And we also are filling in a role in our county with the shooting. It's also become apparent that there are, work that we can do. As Janelle said, in solidarity, hate breeds because of various different conditions that are unattended to, like inequities and wealth and education and healthcare services, especially mental health and so forth. And so unlike other cities that have high Asian American populations where, someone who's targeted can be surrounded by wraparound services, whether that's medical, social service, legal aid, we don't have that. So we thought at the, just as an entry point, at least to start and to talk about, the things that we can do for the Asian American community to build this sort of nonprofit infrastructure so that we'll be in a position to work with other groups to tend to these conditions and, work on them together.
That is great to hear. And I think that, I guess 2018, I worked on a congressional campaign in the Maryland 6th District for an Asian candidate. And so much of, and so I did that in 2018, and in 2017, I worked down in Virginia where I worked with a lot of particularly Korean press outlets. And so what I have learned, originally I'm from Texas, and so I learned a lot about diversity in culture and understanding, because even though those groups were, I guess, geographically close, it was very different experiences. And so particularly the candidate that I worked for in Maryland 6th was Indian. And so it was in the press that I was working with in Virginia were Korean. And so to have this, I guess, vastly different world, culture, understanding of like who they found themselves to be so physically close, I thought was so rich. And I think something that I have enjoyed about the DMV is the richness in culture and richness in diversity, and how you can encounter so many different, I guess, people and spaces and perspectives that come with that. But the downside of that is I do think because America can be such a racialized country, we don't see that. And so I think it's unfortunate that politically cultures can still be seen as a monolith, even in a place where there is so much diversity. But as we transition into I Ain't Sorry in particular, I want to start with you, Aryani, since you were the one who just finished with us. What is something you've learned, I guess, professionally or personally, that you take with you in the work you do?
So this is on my Facebook feed too, or profile, and that is to be the change that you want to see. You could be a bystander, or you could enact that change. And that psychologically is a really big step. I know for me, so I really empathize for people who can see that as a barrier, and they, sort of balk at the idea of being an advocate. But I've learned to eventually, just embrace that and know that I can no longer, rely on these role models as shields. There are times where you're the only one in a field and there's a problem and your visceral gut's telling you you've got to fix that, or otherwise, more people will be impacted. And so, that's what I've done. And eventually there are other people who come and join you, and that opens more doors. So that's my philosophy moving forward. Be the change that you want to see.
Professor Wong?
And yeah, thanks. I think what really motivated me to start getting more involved in this kind of organization that is really, really drawing on Asian American identity is my concern that the Asian American community, some members of the community, could really be posing a challenge to an equity and racial justice agenda. So what I'm talking about here is really, I came into this space really because of challenges to affirmative action by Asian Americans, challenges to school redistricting, challenges to K through 12 integration programs. And, I know from my research that, let's say, the majority of Asian Americans, for instance, are supportive of affirmative action, but a small group of very, in some ways, powerful grassroots organizers has actually come to challenge what I think of as one of the most important systematic tools for racial equity in education, affirmative action. And I'm really fearful that these kinds of movements to really align with white supremacy, with some kinds of structural discrimination against Black and Brown communities and some Asian American communities. And so what drives me here is to, capture, I think, the sentiment, I hope, of the majority of Asian Americans who do support racial equity, who do support affirmative action, who do support integration programs. And I don't think we can ignore the difficult racial terrain that is brought up when people of color challenge racial equity programs. And so that's really what I'm not apologetic for, that, some members of our community attack us for being anti-Asian, right? When we stand up for affirmative action, or when we try to show the benefits of racial integration. And I just think that hopefully, as time moves on, we'll see more and more, as Aryani said, more and more of our community taking a bold stand in support of structural racial equity tools. So that's, I think, what we're here to be unapologetic for.
It's interesting that your I guess unapologetic natures go together, right? So Aryani said that she's trying to be the change she wants to see in the world, and you stepped into this space because you thought that a different narrative was needed, that a counter narrative was needed for how the people that you represent are engaging with these policies. And I think that is really important, mainly because I think part of the diversity is showing that you can advocate for someone without, I guess, agreeing with him on everything is kind of the way that I'm trying to hold this tension. So I'm thinking about the traditional Black conservatives that are often brought out as the anti-racist sentiment. And so I will not give them the power of name dropping them, but I'm sure they know who they are. Understanding that, we're not racist because these people agree with us. And it's well, no, you're intentionally manipulating a small group to imply that the larger agrees with you when you know that isn't true. And so that has often been the tool of the empire, the tool of the state as a divisive means to hide from the very real problems that are created and perpetrated. And so I appreciate both of your being here today to kind of give us a little bit of insight into that. And as we transition into our final segment called Drunk in Love, where I want to give both of you room to just sort of offer us anything that we didn't get a chance to hit on. I know that this is such a wide-ranging topic and we've had such a limited time. So I definitely want to, the 2 minutes isn't like a super fast, hard 2 minutes. I don't have a clock up or anything. But we can start with Professor Wong as far as just something that you really want to have added to this conversation.
I guess I would say that as difficult as this moment is, as difficult as this work can be, it can be challenging to be working towards, racial equity, social justice. Two things really stand out. One is that all of this work is such an opportunity to build community, and I have just been so appreciative of the many new connections I've made in this work to people who can really hear and inspire change. And so I've met so many people who are doing so many good things, and that has been so sustaining, right, over time. And then I think second is that for me, this moment of, attention to anti-Asian sentiment is very real. And also I think it's a reminder that this is the kind of experience that Black and Brown people feel on the regular and deal with on the regular. And so, it's a sad fact, but also one that I think is important to note, that we are not in this alone, that we are all in this together.
Absolutely. Aryani?
Yeah, I agree with Janelle. I think the last 4 or 5 years have been very difficult and have underscored the need for underrepresented, disenfranchised communities, to work together. And I think in the same way that I also subscribe to the idea that each person is like a prism. You're multifaceted. You cannot really be defined by the group that you're in, but in certain political advocacy spaces, that's useful, right? But for that narrow purpose, but not for all time, right? So, I found myself, after, Trump was elected, finding solace and solidarity in many different spaces. I think after that election, I nearly wept with comfort, because I was at a event that was like a Black fraternity event, and they had a choir, and I just felt like finally I was around people that I knew was not going to be adversarial, because after elections, it really seemed like with the, spike in hate crimes, right? I was able to find a political voice with the support of white suburban, moms, who really were like those kitchen activists, right? Who just started pouring into these resistance groups and recognized that here, Asian Americans were not at the numbers in terms of civic participation that they could be, right? Lifted me up, allowed me to be moderators of, candidate forums for governor, for example. I see Japanese Americans who have been longtime advocates in the space because of incarceration as the role models, hearing them tell me about what it was like to live in the incarceration camps and giving me, historical books and documents to read. And so I'm, like Janelle said, I'm finding all these different groups, they're contributing, and we all have to continue to move forward in that way in order to overcome what had been a very appalling development on January 6th, right? And that's the attempt by people who want to retain sort of this white majority dominance over our country. And the one thing I'm not apologetic for is being here. I belong here. We all belong here. I'm not going anywhere. And I don't think America's defined, by your skin color, but by how you embrace freedom and democracy. And that's something that we have to continue to message. And now we know we have to work at it intentionally, continually, and we can only do it together. So thank you.
Amen to all of that, particularly on being unapologetic for being here. I also am unapologetic for being here, regardless as to who that makes uncomfortable. And so I wanted to say that I have enjoyed you both so much. I've learned so much in this conversation. I appreciate you taking your time to speak with me. In the event that someone wanted to reach out to you or follow up about the work you do, Janelle, what's the best way to do that?
So I think the best way is you can check out our website, which is www.MoCoPAAN.org, and our Twitter is MoCoPAAN1. And we would love to hear from you.
Okay. Aryani, did you have anything you wanted to let them know as well?
Yeah, so Janelle got that, and additionally trying to launch a blog called Six Hues, which also talks about the multifaceted perspectives of this one Asian American woman from her perch. So between MoCoPAAN and Six Hues blog, you can track me. Thank you.
Yes,
thank you so
much for being here. I will wrap up here. One moment. We just finished this episode of Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. If you're looking for me, you can find me at Lauren Zayu on Twitter and Instagram. And if you're looking for the show, you can find us at Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered on Facebook and Instagram as well. Thank you for listening. You just finished this episode of Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered with host Lauren Zayu and music by Lighthouse Productions. If you want to learn more about the show, follow at Lauren Zayu on Twitter and Instagram. You can also find more episodes on Facebook and Instagram at Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. Thanks for listening.